and sometimes stayed to dine with him. When his brain was well enough to admit of horse exercise, he rode out a good deal, probably to return these visits, as he generally did not come back till late at night. During this interval, even Adele was seldom sent for to his presence, and all my acquaintance with him was confined to an occasional rencontre in the hall, on the stairs, or in the gallery, when he would sometimes pass me haughtily and coldly, just acknowledging my presence by a distant nod or a cool glance, and sometimes bow and smile with gentlemanlike affability. His change of mood did not offend me, because I saw that I had nothing to do with their alternation. The ebb and flow depended on causes quite disconnected with me. One day he had had company to dinner, and had sent for my portfolio, in order, doubtless, to exhibit its contents. The gentleman went away early to attend a public meeting at Millcote, as Mrs. Fairfax informed me, but the night being wet and inclement, Mr. Rochester did not accompany them. "Is Miss Eyre there?" demanded the master, half rising from his seat to look round to the door near which I stood. "Ah, well, come forward, be seated." He drew a chair near his own. "I am not fond of the prattle of children," he continued, "for, old bachelor as I am, I have no pleasant associations connected with their lisp. It would be intolerable to me to pass a whole evening tete-a-tete with a brat. Don't draw that chair farther off, Miss Eyre. Sit down exactly where I placed it, if you please, that is. Confound these civilities. I continually forget them. Nor do I particularly affect simple-minded old ladies. By the by, I must have mine in mind. It won't do to neglect her. She is a Fairfax, or wed to one, and blood is said to be thicker than water." He rang and dispatched an invitation to Mrs. Fairfax, who soon arrived, knitting basket in hand. "Good evening, madame. I sent to you for a charitable purpose. I have forbidden Adele to talk to me about the presents I brought her, and she is bursting with repletion. Have the goodness to serve her as an auditress and interlocutrace. It will be one of the most benevolent acts you have ever performed." Adele, indeed, no sooner saw Mrs. Fairfax than she summoned her to the sofa, and there quickly filled her lap with the porcelain, the ivory, the waxen contents of her beauté, pouring out, meantime, explanations and raptures in such protege. You will be coming to me some day with notice that you have found another place, that you beg me to look out for a new governess, etc. Eh? No, Adele is not answerable for either her mother's faults or yours. I have a regard for her, and now that I know she is, in a sense, parentless, forsaken by her mother, and disowned by you, sir, I shall cling closer to her than before. How could I possibly prefer the spoiled pet of a wealthy family, who would hate her governess as a nuisance, to a lonely little orphan who leans towards her as a friend? Oh, that is the light in which you view it. Well, I must go now, and you too. It darkens. Chapter 15. I hardly know whether I had slept or not after this conversation. At any rate, I started wide awake on hearing a vague murmur, peculiar and lugubrious, which sounded, I thought, just above me. I wished I had kept my candle burning. The night was drearily dark. My spirits were depressed. I rose and sat up in bed, listening. The sound was hushed. I tried again to sleep, but my heart beat anxiously. My inward tranquillity was broken. The clock, far down in the hall, struck 2. Just then, it seemed my chamber door was touched, as if fingers had swept the panels, in groping away along the dark gallery outside. I said, "Who is there?" Nothing answered. I was chilled with fear. All at once I remembered that it might be Pilot, who, when the kitchen door chanced to be left open, not infrequently found his way up to the threshold of Mr. Rochester's chamber. I had seen him lying there myself in the mornings. The idea calmed me somewhat. I lay down. Silence composes the nerves, and as an unbroken hush now reigned again through the whole house, I began to feel the return of slumber. But it was not fated that I should sleep that night. A dream had scarcely approached my ear when it fled, affrighted, scared by a marrow-freezing incident enough. This was a demonic laugh, low, suppressed, and deep, uttered, as it seemed, at the very keyhole of my chamber door. The head of my bed was near the door, and I thought at first the goblin laughter stood at my bedside, or rather it crouched by my pillow. But I rose, looked around, and could see nothing, while, as I still gazed, the unnatural sound was reiterated, and I knew it came from behind the panels. My first impulse was to rise and fasten the bolt, my next again to cry out, "Who is there?" Something gurgled and moaned. Ere long, steps retreated up the gallery towards the 3rd-story staircase. A door had lately been made to shut in that staircase. I heard it open and close, and all was still. Well, was that Grace Poole, and is she possessed with the devil? Thought I, for I had been warned by Mrs. Fairfax that one of the servants, Grace Poole, occasionally laughed in a demoniacal manner. Impossible now to remain longer by myself. I must go to Mrs. Fairfax. I hurried on my frock and a shawl. I withdrew the bolt and opened the door with a trembling hand. There was a candle burning just outside, and on the matting in the gallery. I was surprised at this circumstance, but still more was I amazed to perceive the air quite dim, as if filled with smoke, and, while looking to the right hand and left, to find whence these blue wreaths issued, I became further aware of a strong smell of burning. Something creaked. It was a door ajar, and that door was Mr. Rochester's, and the smoke rushed in a cloud from thence. I thought no more of Mrs. Fairfax. I thought no more of Grace Poole, or sorceress, who is in the room beside you? Have you plotted to drown me? I will fetch you a candle, sir, and in heaven's name, get up. Somebody has plotted something. You cannot too soon find out who and what it is. There, I am up now, but at your peril. You fetch a candle yet. Wait 2 minutes till I get into some dry garments, if any dry there be. Yes, here is my dressing gown. Now run. I did run. I brought the candle, which still remained in the gallery. He took it from my hand, held it up, and surveyed the bed, all blackened and scorched, the sheets drenched, the carpet round swimming in water. What is it, and who did it? He asked. I briefly related to him what had transpired, the strange laugh I had heard in the gallery, the step ascending to the 3rd story, the smoke, the smell of fire, which had conducted me to his room, in what state I had found matters there, and how I had deluged him with all the water I could lay hands on. He listened very gravely. His face, as I went on, expressed more concern than astonishment. He did not immediately speak when I had concluded. Shall I call Mrs. Fairfax? I asked. Mrs. Fairfax? No. What the deuce would that you call her for? What can she do? Let her sleep unmolested. Then I will fetch Leah and wake John and his wife. Not at all. Just be still. You have a shawl on. If you are not warm enough, you may take my cloak yonder. Wrap it about you, and sit down on the armchair there. I will put it on. Now place your feet on the stool, to keep them out of the wet. I am going to leave you a few minutes. I shall take the candle. Remain where you are till I return. Be as still as a mouse. I must pay a visit to the 3rd story. Don't move, remember, or call anyone. He went. I watched the light withdraw. He passed up the gallery very softly, unclosed the staircase door with as little noise as possible, shut it after him, and the last ray vanished. I was left in total darkness. I listened for some noise, but heard nothing. A very long time elapsed. I grew weary. It was cold, in spite of the cloak. And then I did not see the use of staying, as I was not to rouse the house. I was on the point of risking Mr. Rochester's displeasure by disobeying his orders, when the light once more gleamed dimly on the gallery wall, and I heard his unshod feet tread the matting. I hope it is he, thought I, and not something worse. He re-entered, pale and very gloomy. I have found it all out, said he, setting the candle down on the washstand. It is as I thought. How, sir? He made no reply, but stood with his arms folded, looking on the ground. At the end of a few minutes, he inquired in rather a peculiar tone. I forget whether you said you saw anything when you opened your chamber door. No, sir, only the candlestick on the ground. But you heard an odd laugh. You've heard that laugh before, I should think, or something like it. No, sir, but Mrs. Fairfax has warned me that a servant, Grace Poole, sometimes laughs in that way. Just so, Grace Poole, you have guessed it. She is singular, very. Well, I shall reflect on the subject. Meantime, I am glad that you are the only person, besides myself, acquainted with the precise details of tonight's incident. You are no talking fool. Say nothing about it. must go, sir. But not without taking leave, not without a word or two of acknowledgment and goodwill, not, in short, in that brief, dry fashion. Why, you have saved my life, snatched me from a horrible and excruciating death, and you walk past me as if we were mutual strangers. At least shake hands. He held out his hand. I gave him mine. He took it first in one, then in both his own. You have saved my life. I have a pleasure in owing you so immense a debt. I cannot say more. Nothing else that has being would have been tolerable to me in the character of creditor for such an obligation. But you, it is different. I feel your benefit no burden, Jane. He paused, gazed at me. Words almost visible trembled on his lips, but his voice was checked. Good night again, sir. There is no debt, benefit, burden, obligation in the case. And you, he continued, you would do me good in some way, at some time. I saw it in your eyes when I first beheld you. Their expression and smile did not. Again he stopped. Did not, he proceeded hastily. Strike delight to my very inmost heart, so for nothing. People talk of natural sympathies. I have heard of good genii, but there are grains of truth in the wildest fable. My cherished preserver, good night. Strange energy was in his voice, strange fire in his look. I am glad I happened to be awake, I said, and then I was going. What? You will go? I am cold, sir. Cold? Yes, and standing in a pool. Go then, Jane, go. But he still retained my hand, and I could not free it. I bethought myself of an expedient. I think I hear Mrs. Fairfax move, sir, said I. Well, leave me. He relaxed his fingers, and I was gone. I regained my couch, but never thought of sleep. Till morning dawned, I was tossed on a buoyant, but unquiet sea, where billows of trouble rolled under surges of joy. I thought sometimes I saw beyond its wild waters a shore sweet as the hills of Belua, but now and then a freshing gale, wakened by hope, bore my spirit triumphantly towards the bourne, but I could not reach it, even in fancy. A counteracting breeze blew off the land, and continually drove me back. Sense would resist delirium, judgment would warm passion. Too feverish to rest, I rose as soon as day dawned. I both wished and feared to see Mr. Rochester on the day which followed this sleepless night. I wanted to hear his voice again, yet feared to meet his eye. During the early part of the morning, I momentarily expected his coming. When dusk actually closed, and when Adele left me to go and play in the nursery with Sophie, I did most keenly desire it. I listened for the bell to ring below. I listened for Leah coming up with a message. I fancied sometimes I heard Mr. Rochester's own tread, and I turned to the door, expecting it to open and admit him. The door remained shut, darkness only coming in through the window. Still, it was not too late. He often sent for me at 7 and 8 o'clock, and it was not yet 6. Surely I would not be wholly disappointed tonight, when I had so many things to say to him. I wanted again to introduce the subject of Grace Poole, and to hear what he would answer. which she had hitherto kept up, by the way, I suppose, of making the most of daylight, though dusk was now fast deepening into total obscurity. "It is fair tonight," said she, as she looked through the panes, though not starlight. "Mr. Rochester has, on the whole, had a favourable day for his journey." "Journey? Is Mr. Rochester gone anywhere? I did not know he was out." "Oh, he set off the moment he had breakfasted. He is gone to the Layas, Mr. Eshton's place, 10 miles on the other side of Millcote. I believe there is quite a party assembled there. Lord Ingram, Sir George Lynn, Colonel Dent, and others." "Do you expect him back tonight?" "No, nor tomorrow either. I should think he is very likely to stay a week, or more, when these fine, fashionable people get together. They are so surrounded by elegance and gaiety, so well provided with all that can please and entertain, they are in no hurry to separate. Gentlemen especially are often in request on such occasions, and Mr. Rochester is so talented and so lively in society that I believe he is a general favourite. The ladies are very fond of him, though you would not think his appearance calculated to recommend him particularly in their eyes, but I suppose his acquirements and abilities, perhaps his wealth and good blood, make amends for any little fault of luck." Chapter 16. Mr. Rochester had been absent upwards of a fortnight when the post brought Mrs. Fairfax a letter. "It is from the master," said she, as she looked at their direction. "Now, I suppose, we shall know whether we are to expect his return or not." And, while she broke the seal and perused the document, I went on taking my coffee. We were at breakfast. It was hot, and I attributed to that circumstance a fiery glow, which suddenly rose to my face. Why my hand shook, and why I involuntarily spilt half the contents of my cup into my saucer, I did not choose to consider. "Well, I sometimes think we are too quiet, but we run a chance of being busy enough now, for a little while at least," said Mrs. Fairfax, still holding the note before her spectacles. Ere I permitted myself to request an explanation, I tied the string of Adele's pinafore, which happened to be loose, having helped her also to another bun, and refilled her mug with milk. I said nonchalantly, "Mr. Rochester is not likely to return soon, I suppose." "Indeed he is. In 3 days, he says. That will be next Thursday, and not alone either. I don't know how many of the fine people at the Leys are coming with him. He sends directions for all the best bedrooms to be prepared, and the library and drawing rooms are to be cleaned out, and I am to get more kitchen hands from the George Inn at Millcote, and from wherever else I can, and the ladies will bring their maids, and the gentlemen their valets, so we shall have a full house of it." And Mrs. Fairfax swallowed her breakfast, and hastened away to commence operations. The 3 days were, as she had foretold, busy enough. I had thought all the rooms at Thornfield beautifully clean and well arranged, but it appears I was mistaken. 3 women were got to help, and such scrubbing, such brushing, such washing of paint and beating of carpets, such taking down and putting up of pictures, such polishing of mirrors and lustres, such lighting of fires in bedrooms, such airing of sheets and feather beds on hearths, I never beheld, either before or since. The party were expected to arrive on Thursday afternoon, in time for dinner at 6. During the intervening period, I had no time to nurse chimeras, and I believe I was as active and gay as anybody, Adele excepted. Thursday came. All work had been completed the previous evening. Carpets were laid down, bed hangings festooned, radiant white counterpanes spread, toilet tables arranged, furniture rubbed, flowers piled in vases. Both chambers and saloons looked as fresh and bright as hands could make them. The hall, too, was scoured, and the great carved clock, as well as the steps and banisters of the staircase, were polished to the brightness of glass. In the dining room, the sideboard flashed resplendent with plate. In the drawing room and boudoir, vases of exotics bloomed on all sides. Afternoon arrived. Mrs. Fairfax assumed her best black satin gown, her gloves, and her gold watch, for it was her part to receive the company, to conduct the ladies to their rooms, etc. Adele, too, would be dressed, though I thought she had little chance of being introduced to the party that day at least. However, to please her, I allowed Sophie apparel her in one of her short full muslin frocks. For myself, I had no need to make any change. I should not be called upon to quit my sanctum of the schoolroom, for a sanctum it was now become to me, a very pleasant refuge in time of trouble. It had been a mild, serene spring day, one of those days which, towards the end of March or the beginning of April, rise shining over the earth as heralds of summer. It was drawing to an end now, but the evening was even warm, and I sat at work in the schoolroom with the window open. "It gets late," said Mrs. Fairfax, entering in rustling state. "I am glad I ordered dinner an hour before the time Mr. Rochester mentioned, for it is past 6 now. I have sent John down to the gates to see if there is anything on the road. One can see a long way from thence in the direction of Millcote." She went to the window. "Here he is," said she. "Well, John," leaning out, "any news?" "They're coming, Mom," was the answer. "They'll be here in 10 minutes. Adele flew to the window. I followed, taking care to stand on one side, so that, screened by the curtain, I could see without being seen. The 10 minutes John had given seemed very long, but at last wheels were heard. 4 equestrians galloped up the drive, and after them came 2 open carriages. Fluttering veils and waving plumes filled the vehicle. 2 of the cavaliers were young, dashing-looking gentlemen. The third was Mr. Rochester, on his black horse, Mesrour, pilot bounding before him. At his side rode a lady, and he and she were the first of the party. Her purple riding habit almost swept the ground. Her veil streamed long in the breeze, mingling with its transparent folds, and gleaming through them shone rich raven ringlets. "Miss Ingram!" exclaimed Mrs. Fairfax, and away she hurried to her post below. The cavalcade, following the sweep of the drive, quickly turned the angle of the house, and I lost sight of it. Adele now petitioned to go down, but I took her on my knee and gave her to understand that she must not on any account think of venturing in sight of the ladies, either now or at any other time, unless expressly sent for, that Mr. Rochester would be very angry, etc. Some natural tears she shed on being told this, but as I began to look very grave, she consented at last to wipe them. A joyous stir was now audible in the hall. Gentlemen's deep tones and ladies' silvery accents blent harmoniously together, and distinguishable above all, though not loud, was the sonorous voice of the master of Thornfield Hall, welcoming his fair mademoiselle, voilà cinq ou six heures que nous n'avons pas mangé. Well, now, while the ladies are in their rooms, I will venture down and get you something to eat. And, issuing from my asylum with precaution, I sought a black stairs, which conducted directly to the kitchen. I took possession of a cold chicken, a roll of bread, some tarts, a plate or two, and a knife and fork. With this booty, I made a hasty retreat. I had regained the gallery and was just shutting the back door behind me when an accelerated hum warned me that the ladies were about to issue from their chambers. I could not proceed to the schoolroom without passing some of their doors and running the risk of being surprised when my cargo of victuallage. So I stood still at this end, which, being windowless, was dark, quite dark now, for the sun was set and twilight gathered. Presently the chambers gave up their fair tenants, one after another. Each came out gaily and airily, with dresses that gleamed lustrous through the dusk. For a moment they stood grouped together at the other extremity of the gallery, conversing in a key of sweet, subdued vivacity. They then descended the staircase, almost as noiselessly as the bright mist rolls down the hill. The collective appearance had left me an impression of high-born elegance, such as I had never before received. I found Adele peeping through the schoolroom, which she held ajar. She was really hungry, so the chicken and tarts served to divert her attention for a time. It was well I secured this forage, or both she, I, and Sophie, to whom I conveyed a share of our repast, would have run a chance of getting no dinner at all. Everyone downstairs was too much engaged to think of us. The clock struck 11. I looked at Adele, whose head leaned against my shoulder. Her eyes were waxing heavy, so I took her up in my arms and carried her off to bed. It was near 1 before the gentlemen and ladies sought their chambers. The next day was as fine as its predecessor. It was devoted to the party, to an excursion to some site in the neighbourhood. They set out early in the forenoon, some on horseback, the rest in carriages. I witnessed both the departure and the return. Miss Ingram, as before, was the only lady equestrian, and, as before, Mr. Rochester galloped at her side. The two rode a little apart from the rest. I pointed out this circumstance to Mrs. Fairfax, who was standing at the window with me. "You will see her this evening," answered Mrs. Fairfax. I happened to remark to Mr. Rochester how much Adele wished to be introduced to the ladies, and he said, "Oh, let her come into the drawing-room after dinner, and request Miss Eyre to accompany her." "Yes, he said that from mere politeness. I need not go, I am sure," I answered. "Well, I observed to him that, as you are unused to company, I did not think you would like appearing before at so gay a party, all strangers." And he replied in his quick way, "Nonsense. If she objects, tell her it is my particular wish, and if she resists, say I shall come and fetch her in case of contumacy." "I will not give him that trouble," I answered. "I will go, if no better may be, but I don't like it. Shall you be there, Mrs. Fairfax?" "No, I pleaded off, and he admitted my plea. I'll tell you how to manage so as to avoid the embarrassment of making a formal entrance, which is the most disagreeable part of the business. You must go into the drawing-room while it is empty, before the ladies leave the dinner table. Choose your seat in any quiet nook you like. You need not stay long after the gentlemen come in, unless you please. Just let Mr. Rochester see you are there, and then slip away. Nobody will notice you, these people remain long, do you think? Perhaps 2 or 3 weeks, certainly not more. After the Easter recesses, Sir George Lynn, who was lately elected member for Millcote, will have to go up to town and take his seat. I dare say Mr. Rochester will accompany him. It surprises me that he has already made so protracted a stay at Thornfield. It was with some trepidation that I perceived the hour approach when I was to repair with my charge to the drawing room. Fortunately, there was another entrance to the drawing room than that through the saloon, where they were all seated at dinner. We found the apartment vacant, a large fire burning silently on the marble hearth, and wax candles shining in bright solitude amid the exquisite flowers with which the tables were adorned. The crimson curtains hung before the arch, alight as were the separation this drapery formed from the party in the adjoining saloon. They spoke in so low a key that nothing of their conversation could be distinguished beyond a soothing murmur. A soft sound of rising now became audible. The curtain was swept back from the arch, though through it appeared the dining room, with its lit lustre pouring down light on the silver and glass of a magnificent dessert service, covering a long table. A band of ladies stood in the opening. They entered, and the curtain fell behind them. There were but 8, yet somehow, as they flocked in, they gave the impression of a much larger number. Some of them were very tall, many were dressed in white, and all had a sweeping amplitude of array that seemed to magnify their persons, as a mist magnifies the moon. I rose and curtsied to them. 1 or 2 bent their heads in return. The others only stared at me. They dispersed about the room, reminding me, by the lightness of the buoyancy of their movements, of a flock of white, plumy birds. Some of them threw themselves in half-reclining positions on the sofas and ottomans. Some bent over the tables and examined the flowers and books. The rest gathered in a group around the fire. All talked in a low but clear tone, which seemed habitual to them. I knew their names afterwards, and may as well mention them now. First there was Mrs. Eshton and 2 of her daughters. She had evidently been a handsome woman, and was well preserved still. Of her daughters, the eldest, Amy, was rather little, naive and childlike in face and manner, and piquant in form. Her little muslin dress and blue sash became her well. The second, Louisa, was taller and more elegant in figure, with a very pretty face. Of that order the French term minoise chiffon. Both sisters were fair as lilies. Lady Lynn was a large and stout personage of about 40, very erect, very haughty-looking, richly dressed in a satin robe of changeful sheen. Her dark hair shone glossily under the shade of an azure bloom, and within the circlet of a band of gems. Mrs. Colonel Dent was less showy, but I thought more ladylike. She had a slight figure, a pale, gentle face, and fair hair. Her black satin dress, her scarf of rich foreign lace, and her pearl ornaments pleased me better than the rainbow radiance of the titled dame. But the 3 most distinguished, partly perhaps because the tallest figures of the band, were the Dowager Lady Ingram and her daughters, Blanche and Mary. They were all 3 of the loftiest stature of women. The Dowager might be between 40 and 50. Her shape was still fine, her hair, by candlelight at least, still black. Her teeth, too, were still apparently perfect. Most people would have termed her a splendid woman for age, and so she was, no doubt, physically speaking. But then there was an expression of almost insupportable haughtiness in her bearing and countenance. She had Roman features and a double chin, disappearing into her throat like a pillar. These features appeared to me not only inflated and darkened, but even furrowed with pride, and the chin was sustained by the same principle in a position of almost preternatural erectness. She had, likewise, a fierce and hard eye. It reminded me of Mrs. Read's. She mouthed the words in speaking. Her voice was deep, its inflections very pompous, very dogmatical, very intolerable, in short. A crimson velvet robe and a shawl turban of some gold wrought Indian fabric invested her, I suppose she thought, with a truly imperial dignity. Blanche and Mary were of equal stature, straight and tall as poplars. Mary was too slim for her height, but Blanche was moulded like a Diana. I regarded her, of course, with special interest. First, I wished to see whether her appearance accorded with Mrs. Fairfax's description. Secondly, whether it all resembled the fancied miniature I had painted of her. And thirdly, it will out, whether it were such as I should fancy likely to suit Mr. Rochester's taste. As far as person went, she answered point for point, both to my picture and Mrs. Fairfax's description. The noble bust, the sloping shoulders, the graceful neck, the dark eyes and black ringlets were all there. But her face was like her mother's, a youthful, unfurrowed likeness. The same low brow, the same high features, the same pride. It was not, however, so saturine a pride. She laughed continually. Her laugh was satirical, and so was the habitual expression of her arched and haughty lip. Mary had a milder and more open countenance than Blanche, softer features too, and a skin some shades fairer. Miss Ingram was dark as a Spaniard, but Mary was deficient in life. Her face lacked expression, her eye luster. She had nothing to say, and, having once taken her seat, remained fixed like a statue in its niche. The sisters were both attired in spotless white. And did I now think Miss Ingram such a choice as Mr. Rochester would be likely to make? I could not tell. I did not know his taste in female beauty. If he liked the majestic, she was the very type of majesty. Then she was accomplished, sprightly. Most gentlemen would admire her, I thought, and that he did admire her, I already seemed to have obtained proof. To remove the last shade of doubt, it remained but to see them together. You are not to suppose, reader, that Adele has all this time been sitting motionless on the stool at my feet. No, when the ladies entered, she rose, advanced to meet them, made a steady reverence, and said with gravity, "Monsieur, Madames," and Miss Ingram had looked down at her with a mocking air and exclaimed, "Oh, what a little puppet!" Lady Lynch had remarked, "It is Mr. Rochester's ward, I suppose, the little French girl he was speaking of." Mrs. Dent had kindly taken her hand and given her a kiss. Amy and Louisa Eshton had cried out simultaneously, "What a love of a child!" And then they had called her to a sofa, where she now sat ensconced between them, chattering alternately in French and broken English, absorbing not only the young lady's attention, but that of Mrs. Eshton and Lady Lynn, and getting spoiled to her heart's content. At last coffee is brought in, and the gentlemen are summoned. I sit in the shade, if any shade there be in this brilliantly lit apartment. The window curtain costumed in black. Most of them are tall, some young. Henry and Frederick Lynn are very dashing sparks indeed, and Colonel Dent is a fine soldierly man. Mr. Ashton, the magistrate of the district, is gentlemanlike. His hair is quite white, his brows and whiskers still dark, which gives him something of the appearance of a père noble de théâtre. Lord Ingram, like his sisters, is very tall. Like them also, he is handsome, but he shares Mary's apathetic and listless look. He seems to have more length of limb than vivacity of blood or vigour of brain. And where is Mr. Rochester? He comes in last. I am not looking at the arch, yet I see him enter. I try to concentrate my attention on those netting needles, on the meshes of the birds I am forming. I wish to think only of the work I have in my hands, to see the silver beads and silk threads that lie in my lap, whereas I distinctly behold his figure, and I inevitably recall the moment when I last saw it. But just after I had rendered him what he deemed an essential service, and he, holding my hand and looking down on my face, surveyed me with eyes that revealed heartful and eager to overflow, in whose emotions I had a part. How near had I approached him at that moment? What had occurred since, calculated to change his and my relative positions? Yet now, how distant, how far estranged we were, so far estranged that I did not expect him to come and speak to me. I did not wonder when, without looking at me, he took a seat at the other side of the room and began conversing with some of the ladies. No sooner did I see that his attention was riveted on them, and that I might gaze without being observed, than my eyes were drawn involuntarily to his face. I could not keep their lids under control. They would rise, and the irids would fix on him. I looked, and had an acute pleasure in looking, a precarious yet poignant pleasure, pure gold, with a steely point of agony, a pleasure like what the thirst-perishing man might feel, who knows the well to which he has crept is poisoned, yet stoops and drinks divine draughts nevertheless. Most true is it that beauty is in the eye of the gazer. My master's colourless olive face, square, massive brow, broad and jetty eyebrows, deep eyes, strong features, firm, grim mouth, all energy, decision, will, were not beautiful according to rule, but they were more than beautiful to me. They were full of an interest and influence that quite mastered me, that took my feelings from my own power and fettered them in his. Coffee is handed. The ladies, since the gentlemen entered, have become lively as larks. Conversation waxes brisk and merry. Colonel Dent and Mr. Ashton argue on politics. Their wives listen. The two proud dowagers, Lady Lynn and Lady Ingram, confabulate together. Sir George, whom, by the by, I have forgotten to describe, a very big and very fresh-looking country gentleman, stands before their sofa, coffee cup in hand, and occasionally puts in a word. Mr. Frederick Lynn has taken a seat beside Mary Ingram, and is showing her the engraving of the splendid volume. She looks, smiles now and then, but apparently says little. The tall and phlegmatic Lord Ingram leans with folded arms on the chair back of the little and lively Amy Ashton. She glances up at him and chatters like a wren. She likes him better than she does Mr. Rochester. Henry Lynn has taken possession of an ottoman at the feet of Louisa. Adele shares it with him. He is trying to talk French with her, and Louisa laughs at his blunders. Miss Ingram, who had now seated herself with proud grace at the piano, spreading out her snowy robes, attitude, commenced a brilliant prelude, talking meantime. She appeared to be on her high horse tonight. Both her words and her air seemed intended to excite not only the admiration, but the amazement of her auditors. She was evidently bent on striking them as something very dashing and daring indeed. Now is my time to slip away, thought I. But the tones that then severed an air arrested me. Mrs. Fairfax had said Mr. Rochester possessed a fine voice. He did, a mellow, powerful bass, into which he threw his own feeling, his own force, finding a way through the ear to the heart, and there waking sensation strangely. I waited till the last deep and full vibration had expired, till the tide of talk, checked an instant, had resumed its flow. I then quitted to my sheltered corner, and made my exit by the side door, which was fortunately near. Thence a narrow passage led into the hall. In crossing it, I perceived my sandal was loose. I stopped to tie it, kneeling down for that purpose on the mat at the foot of the staircase. I heard the dining room door unclose. A gentleman came out. Rising hastily, I stood face to face with him. It was Mr. Rochester. "How do you do?" he asked. "I am very well, sir. Why did you not come and speak to me in the room?" I thought I might have retorted the question on him who put it, but I would not take that freedom. I answered, "I did not wish to disturb you, as you seemed engaged, sir." "What have you been doing during my absence?" "Nothing particular. Teaching Adele as usual." "And getting a good deal paler than you were, as I saw at first sight. What is the matter?" "Nothing at all, sir." "Did you take any cold that night you have drowned me?" "Not the least." "Return to the drawing room. You are deserting too early." "I am tired, sir." He looked at me for a minute. "And a little depressed," he said. "What about? Tell me." "Nothing. Nothing, sir. I am not depressed." "But I affirm that you are. So much depressed that a few more words would bring tears to your eyes. Indeed, they are there now, shining and swimming, and a bead has slipped from the lash and fallen on the flag. If I had time, and was not in mortal dread of some prating prig